This presentation contains descriptions of violence and mythological themes that may be disturbing to some viewers. Discretion is advised. What if I told you there was a drink that could turn anyone in an instant into a genius? A liquid that grants perfect eloquence, boundless creativity, and the ability to persuade anyone of anything. A substance that could make you the greatest poet, the most brilliant scientist, or the most charismatic leader the world has ever known. This isn't science fiction. According to the ancient Norse, this drink was real. It was called the Mead of Poetry, and its recipe was paid for with murder. The first ingredient was the blood of a god. The question isn't whether you would take a sip. The question is, what would you be willing to do to get it? To understand how this divine elixir was created, you have to go back to the dawn of time, to a war that almost tore the universe apart. Long before humanity, long before the Vikings, there were two families of gods. On one side, the Aesir, gods of war, order, and power. Think Odin, the Allfather, and Thor, the god of thunder. They were strategists, warriors, rulers. They built their celestial city, Asgard, with logic and might. On the other side were the Vanir, gods of nature, fertility, and magic. They were beings of the earth, of the sea, of life itself. They commanded the seasons, the harvests, and the untamable forces of the wild. For eons, these two pantheons fought a brutal, grinding war. It was a conflict of fundamental forces: order versus chaos, civilization versus nature. Aesir armies clashed with Vanir magic on battlefields that spanned entire worlds. Mountains were shattered, stars were extinguished. But neither side could gain a final advantage. The Aesir's strength was matched by the Vanir's sorcery. Their war became a cosmic stalemate, a wound in the fabric of reality that refused to heal. The constant violence was bleeding the universe dry, and the wisest among both sides knew it could not continue. If they didn't find a way to make peace, they would annihilate each other, and all of creation with them. So they called a truce. The two warring families of gods met on a neutral field, their weapons laid aside but their suspicion still sharp in their eyes. To seal their pact, to create a bond that could never be broken, they performed a strange and sacred ritual. One by one, every god from the Aesir and every god from the Vanir stepped forward and spat into a single great golden vat. It was a bizarre, even disgusting act, but it was deeply symbolic. They were merging their essences, their saliva carrying their divine nature, their power, their wisdom, and their magic. They were creating something new, a living symbol of their truce. From this divine mixture, a being was born. He was not Aesir, nor was he Vanir. He was something more. They named him Kvasir, and he was the wisest being who had ever existed. Imagine a mind with no limits. Kvasir knew the answer to any question you could ask him. He understood the secret language of the birds, the slow thoughts of the mountains, the intricate dance of the stars. He could explain the origins of the cosmos or the deepest sorrows of a human heart with equal clarity. He was a living library of all knowledge, a biological singularity of pure intellect. But it wasn't just his intelligence that made him extraordinary. It was his empathy. Kvasir traveled across the 9 realms, and wherever he went, he brought peace and understanding. He could walk into a village torn apart by feuds and, with a few carefully chosen words, mend generations of hatred. He could calm the rage of kings and soothe the fears of children. His wisdom wasn't a weapon. It was a gift he shared freely with anyone who sought it. He was the living embodiment of the peace treaty, a perfect being created from the union of gods. And for that he was loved, but not by everyone. Deep in the mountains, in the cavernous realm of Svartalfheim, lived the dwarves. They were master craftsmen, beings of stone and fire who could forge magical artifacts of incredible power. And two of the most cunning and most cruel were the brothers Fjalar and Galar. They heard the stories of Kvasir, this walking god of wisdom, and they didn't feel awe. They felt envy, a bitter, corrosive envy that gnawed at their hearts. They saw Kvasir not as a gift to the world, but as a resource to be exploited. They saw his divine essence as a raw material, the ultimate ingredient for their greatest and most terrible creation. So they laid a trap. The brothers invited the wise and gentle Kvasir to their underground forge, promising a feast and a great debate on the nature of creation. Kvasir, who saw the good in all beings, suspected nothing. He traveled to their mountain home, eager to share his knowledge. He was welcomed with false smiles and poisoned ale. As he sat at their table, explaining the secrets of the universe, The two dwarves crept up behind him. There was no battle, no grand struggle, just the cold, quiet efficiency of a butcher's shop. They slit Kvasir's throat and let his divine blood drain into 3 massive vessels. 2 great cauldrons they called Sun and Bon, and a kettle named Rear, the stirrer of ecstasy. The murder was complete. The wisest being in the universe lay dead on the stone floor of their forge. But for Jailer and Galer, the real work was just beginning. They took the blood, dark, shimmering and thick with divine power, and began their profane alchemy. Into the 3 vessels they mixed Kvasir's blood with golden frothing honey. Honey was the food of the gods, a substance of life and sweetness. They were blending the essence of divine knowledge with the essence of divine sustenance. They sealed the cauldrons and let the mixture ferment, a dark and secret process hidden from the eyes of both gods and men. Days turned into weeks. Inside the 3 vessels, a miraculous transformation was taking place. The blood of the murdered god, the life force of the wisest being in creation, was brewing into a potent, intoxicating mead. This wasn't just alcohol. It was liquid poetry. It was fluid genius. It was the distilled essence of Kvasir's soul. Anyone who drank even a single drop would be instantly gifted with his unparalleled wisdom, his perfect eloquence, his boundless creativity. They would become a skald, a master poet and storyteller, capable of weaving words so powerful they could charm kings, inspire armies, and even alter the fabric of reality itself. When the dwarves finally unsealed the cauldrons, the air in their forge filled with an aroma so intoxicating it was said to drive lesser men mad. The liquid inside was the color of deep ruby, swirling with an inner light. They had done it. They had captured lightning in a bottle. They possessed the single most valuable substance in the entire cosmos. A single sip could make them more influential than any king, more revered than any god. But their triumph was poisoned by their crime. When the gods noticed Kvasir's absence, they sent messengers to ask the dwarves if they had seen him. Jailer and Galer, with chilling composure, lied. They claimed that Kvasir had simply choked on his own intelligence, that there was no one in the world smart enough to ask him questions, and so he had suffocated on his own wisdom. It was a clever lie, one that played on Kvasir's legendary intellect. The gods for a time believed them. The dwarves were safe for now. They held the ultimate power in their hands, hidden deep beneath the earth. They had created the mead of poetry, the drink of genius, from an act of unspeakable evil. They believed their secret was secure, that their newfound power would make them untouchable. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had stolen the essence of a being created by the gods, and they had committed their crime in a universe watched over by Odin, the All-Father, the god who sacrificed his own eye for a single drink from the well of wisdom. The dwarves had created the most powerful substance in existence. But how do you hide a stolen god from the god who sees everything? You don't. You simply cannot hide anything from the one who sits on Hliskjolf, the high seat from which he can gaze into all the 9 realms. The dwarves, Jailer and Galer, knew this. They were masters of the forge, not masters of deception on a cosmic scale. Every moment they possessed the mead of poetry was a moment spent under the burning gaze of a god who craved knowledge above all else. The very air seemed to crackle with the Allfather's silent scrutiny. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. This wasn't a treasure. It was a death sentence. They had to get it out of their mountain hall. They had to put it somewhere Odin would never think to look, or somewhere so drenched in chaos and blood that even he might overlook it. Their greed had given way to a primal fear. And fear, like greed, makes monsters of us all. Their journey with the 3 precious vats, Rear, Bon and Sun, is not recorded in great detail, but we know where their fear led them. It led them out of their dark, glittering caverns and into the vast frost-bitten lands of Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. Why there? Perhaps they thought the constant strife between the gods and the giants would provide enough cover, enough noise and distraction to hide their prize. Or perhaps their dark hearts were simply drawn to a land of equal darkness. It was here they encountered a giant by the name of Gilling. Now, Gilling wasn't a particularly remarkable giant. He wasn't a great warrior or a powerful sorcerer. He was simply a giant, enormous, ancient, and living a quiet life with his wife. He was, however, tragically hospitable. He saw the 2 dwarves far from their home and invited them in. A fatal mistake. As the dwarves shared his food and sat by his fire, they weren't seeing a host. They were seeing an opportunity. A patsy. They had the mead. a substance of divine origin, and now they were stained with the murder of a god, Kvasir. What was one more crime? What was the life of a simple giant compared to their own? They invited Gilling to go fishing with them on a vast, dark lake. The giant, suspecting nothing, agreed. They rowed out to the center of the lake, the water black and cold enough to steal the breath from your lungs. The dwarves rowed, their small, powerful arms pulling the oars through the still water. Gilling sat in the boat, a mountain of a man enjoying the quiet. Then, with a shared wicked glance, the dwarves steered the boat directly into a submerged reef. The crash was violent. The boat splintered, capsizing instantly, throwing them all into the freezing water. The dwarves, being small and nimble, scrambled onto the overturned hull with ease. But Gilling the giant could not swim. He thrashed in the icy depths, his massive hands grasping for purchase, his roars of panic echoing across the water. The dwarves just watched. They watched as his strength failed, as the cold seeped into his bones, as his head slipped beneath the surface for the last time. They didn't lift a finger. To them it was just an accident. They rowed the broken boat back to shore, and went to Gilling's home to deliver the tragic news. Gilling's wife, upon hearing of her husband's death, was consumed by a grief so immense, so powerful it was terrifying. Her wails were not human sounds. They were the sound of mountains breaking, of glaciers calving into the sea. Her sorrow was a physical force, a storm of sound that shook the very foundations of the hall and grated on the dwarves' nerves. They couldn't stand it. This raw, unfiltered emotion was an inconvenience, an annoyance, so they decided to silence it. Jailer climbed up onto the roof of the great hall, positioning himself directly above the doorway. Gaylor went inside and told the grieving giantess that she should come outside, that she could see the spot where her husband had drowned, to say her final goodbyes. As the heartbroken woman stepped through the threshold, her eyes blinded by tears, Jailer dropped a massive millstone directly on her head. Her colossal grief was ended in a single brutal, crushing instant. 2 giants murdered. Not for gain, not for glory, but for convenience. The dwarves felt nothing. They had solved their problem. But the blood of giants, like the blood of gods, leaves a stain that cannot be washed away. News travels fast in Jotunheim, especially news of murder. And Gilling had a son named Suttungr. And Suttungr was not like his father. He was immense, powerful, and filled with a rage that could freeze fire. When he heard what the dwarves had done, he hunted them down. It didn't take long. He found them, these 2 arrogant, blood-soaked creatures, and he didn't bother with a trial. He seized them, one in each of his colossal hands, and carried them out to the sea. He found a small skerry, a tiny rock that would be completely submerged at high tide. He chained them to it and left them there, the cold waves already licking at their feet. He told them they could sit there and think about what they had done as the tide slowly, inevitably, rose to drown them. This was a terror the dwarves had never known. Not the quick fear of Odin's gaze, but the slow, creeping certainty of a cold, wet death. They begged. They pleaded. They screamed for their lives. Suttungr simply stood on the shore, watching, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. Finally, in their ultimate desperation, the dwarves played their only card. They offered him a bribe. Not gold, not jewels. What would a giant care for such trinkets? They offered him the price for his father and mother's lives. They offered him their greatest treasure and their greatest burden. They offered him the Mead of Poetry. Suttungr's interest was piqued. He knew of Kvasir. He knew of the god's legendary wisdom. The idea of a drink made from his very essence, that was a payment worthy of a giant's vengeance. It was a wergild, a blood price of cosmic proportions. He agreed. He unchained the sniveling dwarves and took from them the 3 great vats, Rear, Bon, and Sun. He now possessed the most powerful substance in the 9 realms. But Suttungr was no fool. He understood the danger that came with it. He knew the gods, especially Odin, would eventually learn of its existence. He had seen what its possession had driven the dwarves to do. He would not make their mistake. He took the mead and traveled deep into the mountains, to a fortress carved from the living rock of a peak named Nipjord, the Clashing Rocks. There, in a chamber buried in the heart of the mountain, he hid the 3 vats. But even that wasn't enough. A treasure this great needed a guardian, a living, breathing guardian who would never falter, never sleep, and never be tempted. He entrusted the Mead of Poetry to the one being in all the realms he trusted implicitly, his own daughter, the giantess Gunlod. She was to sit in that dark chamber, to watch over the vats day and night, for all eternity if need be. She was to let no one enter, no one see them, and certainly no one taste them. The Mead of Poetry was finally secure. It was hidden from the world, locked away in the heart of a mountain, in the land of the giants, guarded by a loyal and powerful giantess. It was safe from dwarves, safe from men, safe from all but the most determined thief. But a secret of this magnitude cannot be kept forever. Whispers have a way of traveling on the wind, of being carried from realm to realm. And eventually, those whispers reached the ears of the one being in the cosmos who desired that mead more than anything. The one who had already sacrificed an eye for a sip of wisdom, and would gladly sacrifice so much more. The secret was safe from the world, but it was not safe from a god, especially not a god who was already listening. Odin, the Allfather, the Wanderer, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, sat on his high throne Hliskjolf, from which he could see all that transpired in the 9 realms. But sight was only one sense. For hearing, for the secrets whispered in the darkest corners of the world, he had other servants. Every morning at dawn, 2 ravens would launch from his shoulders and fly out into the cosmos. One was named Hugin, which means thought. The other was Munin, memory. They were his spies, his extensions, his collectors of whispers and rumors, and they missed nothing. They had circled the smoking peaks of Muspelheim and the frozen wastes of Niflheim. They had watched the affairs of men in Midgard and the constructions of the elves in Alfheim. But it was in the deep stony darkness of Nidavellir, the realm of the dwarves, that they heard the most curious tale. They heard the boasts of 2 brothers, Fjalar and Galar, spoken only when they were deep in their cups, bragging of a feat of alchemy that defied the gods themselves. They spoke of a man made of spit, of a brutal murder, and of 3 vats, Bod and Sun, and the great cauldron Rear, filled with a substance of unimaginable power. A mead they called it. A mead that could grant the gift of poetry and transcendent knowledge to any who drank it. When Hugin and Munin returned to Asgard that evening, they landed upon Odin's shoulders as they always did, their black feathers rustling against his gray cloak. But the news they croaked into his ears was unlike any they had brought before. They spoke of the dwarves' dark secret, of the murder of the wise being Kvasir, and the brewing of the miraculous mead. As Odin listened, his single eye, which could see into the hearts of men and the fabric of destiny, narrowed. A familiar fire ignited within him. It was the same fire that had driven him to hang from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, a sacrifice of himself to himself, just to learn the secrets of the runes. It was the same insatiable hunger that had led him to the well of Mimir, where he paid the ultimate price, his own eye, for a single drink of its cosmic wisdom. But this was different. The wisdom of Mimir's well was ancient, primal, a truth that had to be interpreted. The knowledge of the runes was a tool, a language of power that required mastery and study. This mead the dwarves had created was a shortcut. It was pure, unadulterated genius, bottled and ready to be consumed. It was a power that could be stolen, a weapon that could be wielded. And in the hands of his enemies, the giants of Jotunheim, it would be a catastrophe. In his own hands, however, it would be the final key, the ultimate instrument of power and understanding. He had to have it. But the Allfather knew that force was not the answer. The dwarves were masters of their domain. Their mountain halls were honeycombed with traps and dead ends, their defenses impenetrable. To march on them as the king of Asgard would be to invite disaster. They would sooner pour the mead into the molten heart of the mountain than let it fall into his hands. No, this required a different approach. It required guile. It required deception. It required the side of him that was not a king, but a wanderer, a trickster. Odin descended from his high throne. He shed his royal armor and his majestic robes. He set aside his spear, Gungnir, that never missed its mark. He transformed himself. When he walked out of the gates of Asgard, he was no longer the ruler of the gods. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man of late middle age, weathered and strong. He wore simple, homespun clothes and carried a long, sharp scythe over his shoulder. He called himself Balverk, a name that meant evil worker. It was a fitting name for the dark work he intended to do. His journey took him across the Bifrost Bridge and into Midgard. He walked for leagues, his long strides eating up the miles, until he reached the lands that bordered the mountains of the dwarves. These lands were owned by a giant named Bogi, and Odin, through his vast network of knowledge, knew something crucial. Bogi was the brother of a far more powerful and fearsome giant named Suttungr. It was Suttungr who would soon come to possess the mead. Bogi was the first link in a chain that Odin intended to shatter. As Balverk approached Bogi's farm, he came upon a vast field of hay. 9 massive servants were working there, swinging their scythes with sluggish, frustrated motions. They were complaining loudly, cursing the summer heat, their cruel master, and most of all their dull blades. The blades were so blunt they were tearing the grass more than cutting it. This was the opening Odin had been waiting for. He walked up to the sweating, grumbling workers. He greeted them with a simple nod. "You work hard," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but your tools work against you." One of the servants, a hulking man with a matted red beard, spat on the ground. "And who are you to tell us? These are the finest scythes our master will give us. Dull as a troll's wit they are." Balverk offered a thin smile. He reached into a pouch on his belt and produced a whetstone, a long, smooth piece of gray stone that seemed to hum with a faint energy in the sunlight. "A good worker is nothing without a good edge," he said. "Allow me." He took the red-bearded servant's scythe. With swift, expert motions, he drew the whetstone along the curved steel blade. The sound it made was not the grating scrape of stone on metal. It was a high, clear, ringing song, a sheeing that seemed to vibrate in the very air. He tested the edge with his thumb, then handed it back. "Try it now." The servant, skeptical, took the scythe. He swung it at a patch of uncut hay. The blade passed through the stalks with a whisper, so cleanly and effortlessly that the servant almost stumbled from the lack of resistance. His eyes went wide. He swung again and again. A perfect, clean swath was cut in seconds. The other 8 servants stopped their work, their jaws agape. They crowded around, clamoring for Balverk to sharpen their scythes as well. One by one, Odin took their tools and gave them an edge so sharp they could split a falling hair. In minutes, the 9 servants were working with a speed and ease they had never known. The field was being mown in record time. They laughed and praised the stranger and his magical stone. They began to plead with him. "Sell us the stone, wanderer," one cried. "Name your price." "We must have it," another shouted, his eyes gleaming with greed. Soon they were all begging, arguing amongst themselves over who deserved it more. Balverk, the evil worker, held up a hand to silence them. He looked at their covetous faces, at the way they eyed each other with suspicion, and he knew his plan was working perfectly. "I have no need for coin," he said calmly, "but I will part with the stone. I will give it to whichever of you is quick enough to catch it." Before they could fully process his words, Odin tossed the whetstone high into the air. It tumbled end over end, a gray speck glinting against the bright blue sky. 9 pairs of eyes followed it. 9 minds consumed by a single, sudden, overwhelming desire. The camaraderie of a moment before vanished, replaced by raw animal greed. They forgot they were co-workers. They forgot they were holding instruments of death, now honed to a supernatural sharpness. They only saw the prize. They lunged. It was a maelstrom of chaos. They scrambled over each other, shoving and clawing, each man desperate to be the one standing under the falling stone. One servant pushed another, who stumbled back into a third. A scythe held carelessly swung wide. Its impossibly sharp edge met the neck of a neighbor, and blood sprayed across the golden hay. There was a moment of shocked silence broken by a scream. But the scream was not of horror, it was of rage. The sight of blood did not stop them. It drove them mad. They turned on each other in a blind, murderous frenzy. A blade meant for cutting grass sliced through a man's chest. Another swung in a low arc, severing legs. They hacked and slashed, their own greed turning Odin's gift into a curse that consumed them all. The entire bloody affair was over in less than a minute. The whetstone landed softly in the grass with a quiet thud. The field was silent once more, the air thick with the coppery smell of blood. 9 bodies lay twisted among the freshly cut hay, their once dull scythes now gleaming crimson in the sun. Odin, the wanderer Balverk, walked calmly through the carnage. He bent down, picked up his whetstone, and wiped it clean on a tuft of grass. He had just orchestrated the murder of 9 men without laying a hand on any of them. He had created a labor shortage. A very sudden, very desperate labor shortage. And he knew the giant boggy would now be in urgent need of a strong, skilled farmhand to bring in his harvest before it rotted in the fields. The first move had been made. He tucked the stone back into his belt and began walking toward the giant's farmhouse, his face a mask of grim purpose. The path to the Mead of Poetry was now open. Every step Bolverk took crunched on the dry, thirsty earth. The air was thick with the smell of sun-baked dust and wilting grain. Ahead, in a vast golden valley, lay the farm of the giant boggy. But this wasn't a scene of rustic prosperity. This was a portrait of desperation. The field shimmered under a heat that felt less like warmth and more like a physical weight. And in that heat, 9 figures moved with the agonizing slowness of men fighting a losing war. These were Boggy's farmhands, 9 massive thralls, swinging their scythes against an endless ocean of wheat. But their movements were clumsy, ragged. Each swing was a grunt of effort, each step a weary shuffle. Their blades weren't cutting the stalks so much as bludgeoning them, tearing and mangling the grain. They were working themselves to death, but their tools were failing them. The harvest was too big, the sun too hot, and their scythes were as dull as river stones. From a distance, Bolverk could hear the discordant scrape of metal on stalk, a sound of pure, grinding futility. He didn't approach them like a god or even a stranger. He walked with the easy gait of a fellow laborer, a man who knew the ache of a long day's work. As he drew closer, the 9 thralls paused, leaning on their scythes, wiping sweat from their brows with the backs of their massive hands. They looked at him with suspicion, their faces grim with exhaustion. "A hard day for a harvest," Bolverk said, his voice calm and even, a cool stone in the blazing heat. One of the giants spat on the ground. "The day's not the problem. It's these blasted blades. They won't hold an edge. We spend more time trying to sharpen them than we do cutting." Bolverk nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the dull, nicked edges of their scythes. "A poor tool makes for a poor worker," he said, more to himself than to them. Then, he reached into his belt and pulled out the whetstone. It didn't look like much, just a simple gray stone. But as the sunlight hit it, it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, holding a deep, cool power within. He held it up. "I have a stone here," he said, his voice carrying over the field. "A gift from the dwarves of the Dark Mountains. It puts an edge on a blade that can split a falling hair." The farmhand scoffed, a low rumble of disbelief. They had stones of their own, worn smooth from useless effort. But Bolverk just smiled. He gestured to the nearest giant. "Let me see your scythe." Warily, the giant handed it over. Bolverk took the heavy tool, its blade chipped and blunt. He ran his thumb over the edge and grimaced as if he'd touched something foul. Then he set to work. He didn't scrape or grind. He simply drew the dwarven whetstone along the length of the blade, once, twice. The sound it made was not the grating screech they were used to. It was a song, a high, clear, ringing hum that vibrated in the air, a sound of perfect harmony between stone and steel. When he was done, the blade had transformed. The nicks were gone. The edge was no longer a blunt line of metal but an invisible threat, a sliver of light that seemed to slice the air itself. He handed the scythe back to its owner. "Try it now." The giant took it, his eyes wide. The scythe felt different in his hands, lighter, more alive. He turned to the nearest stand of wheat, a section he had been hacking at for an hour. He swung. There was no sound of impact, no tearing, no resistance. The blade passed through the thick stalks as if they were mist. A perfect, clean arc of golden stems fell silently to the ground. The giant stared, dumbfounded, at the scythe in his hand, then at the effortless cut, then back at Bolverk. A murmur went through the other 8. They crowded closer, their exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a raw, hungry curiosity. One by one, they thrust their scythes at Bolverk. "Mine next." "Do mine." Bolverk obliged. For each of them, he drew the singing stone along their blades, and for each of them, he handed back not a tool, but a weapon of impossible sharpness. They returned to the field, but now it was different. There were no more grunts of effort, only the whisper of steel through grain. They moved with a speed and grace they had never known, felling swaths of wheat with single fluid motions. The work of hours was being done in minutes. They laughed, a booming sound of sheer relief and exhilaration. They had been given a miracle, and that was exactly what Bolverk wanted. He let them work for a while, let them feel the power, let the magic of the stone sink deep into their bones. He let them taste what it was like to be masters of their labor, not its slaves. He watched as their gratitude slowly curdled into something else. They began to glance at each other, and then at him. Their eyes weren't on their work anymore. They were on the stone in his belt. Finally, Bolverk raised a hand, and they stopped, their new perfect scythes resting in their hands. "The stone is a fine thing, is it not?" he asked. The 9 giants nodded eagerly, their eyes gleaming with avarice. "It has served me well. But I am a wanderer, and I have no fields to mow. Perhaps one of you might have more use for it than I." A tense silence fell over the field. The air crackled. The 9 farmhands looked at Bolverk, then at each other. Their camaraderie, born of shared misery, was gone. Now they were 9 rivals. Each of them wanted the stone. Each of them believed they deserved it more than the others. "I will not simply give it away," Bolverk continued, his voice low and steady. "And I cannot cut it into 9 pieces. So I will let fate decide. The one with the quickest hands and the sharpest, I shall have it." And with that, he tossed the whetstone high into the air. It arced up against the blue sky, a gray speck tumbling end over end, catching the sun. For a heartbeat, 9 pairs of eyes followed its flight. And then chaos erupted. The 9 giants lunged. They forgot they were colleagues. They forgot everything except the prize falling from the sky. They shoved, clawed, and scrambled toward the spot where the stone would land, a frantic knot of muscle and greed. But in their hands they still held the scythes. The scythes that Bolverk had just sharpened to a razor's edge. In their desperate, clumsy lunge the blade swung wild. A giant tripped, and the scythe of the man behind him caught him across the back. Another turned to shove a rival, only to meet the sweeping arc of a blade meant for wheat. There were no battle cries, only shocked grunts and screams of agony. What Bolverk had given them as a gift, they now turned upon each other as weapons. The beautiful humming blades that had whispered through the grain now sliced through flesh and bone with the same horrifying ease. It was over in seconds, a bloody tangled mess of limbs and steel. The whetstone landed softly in the dirt with a quiet thud. Silence returned to the field, broken only by the buzzing of flies. Bolverk stood alone, surrounded by the ruin he had engineered. 9 bodies lay dead in the wheat, their perfectly sharpened scythes fallen beside them. He calmly walked over, picked up the whetstone, wiped it clean on his trousers, and tucked it back into his belt. He hadn't laid a hand on any of them. He had simply understood their nature. He had identified their deepest desire, given them a taste of it, and then watched them destroy themselves to possess it. It was then that the owner of the farm, the giant Boggy, arrived. He crested a nearby hill and stopped dead, his face a mask of horror. His entire workforce, his whole harvest, lay in a heap of blood and ruin. He let out a roar of fury and grief that shook the valley. He stomped down into the field, his eyes fixing on the lone, calm figure standing amidst the carnage. "What is this? What have you done?" Boggy bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. Bolverk didn't flinch. He met the giant's gaze. "They had a disagreement over a piece of property," he said simply. "It seems they settled it." Boggy stared at the bodies at the half-mown field, at the sun beating down on his rotting harvest. He was ruined. He was desperate. And Bolverk knew it. "You have a problem, farmer," Bolverk said, his voice taking on a new tone of authority. "Your harvest is ripe, and your workers are unavailable. You need help. You need the work of 9 men." Boggy looked at this strange, wiry man. He was filled with rage, but also a sliver of desperate hope. "And you think you can do the work of 9? He sneered. "I can," Bolverk said, his confidence absolute. "I will bring in every last stalk of your grain before the first frost. I will work all summer, from sunup to sundown. I will do the work of all 9 of these fallen fools." Boggy was suspicious. This was too good to be true. "And what is your price, stranger?" "I have little gold to offer." Here it was, the culmination of the entire gambit. The slaughter, the whetstone, all of it had led to this single moment of negotiation. "I don't want your gold," Bolverk said, his eyes locking onto Boggy's. "My price is simple. When the harvest is done and your barns are full, you will give me 1 single drink from your brother's mead." Boggy froze. His brother was Suttungr, and Suttungr's mead was no ordinary drink. It was the stuff of legend, guarded jealousy in the heart of a mountain. "You mean the Mead of Poetry?" he whispered, a flicker of understanding and fear in his eyes. "One drink," Bolverk repeated. "That is my wage." Boggy looked from the stranger to his dead workers, to his endless dying fields. He was trapped, ruined without this man's help, but terrified of the price. Yet what choice did he have? A summer's labor for a single sip of a drink he didn't even own. It seemed a small price to pay for his survival. "You have a deal," the giant rumbled, sealing his fate. "Save my harvest, and I will get you your drink." Bolverk smiled, a thin, cold smile of victory. He bent down and picked up the nearest scythe, its edge still gleaming from the touch of his stone. He tested its weight, feeling the perfect balance. The deal was struck. An entire summer of impossible labor now stood between him and his prize. But for a god playing the long game, a single summer was merely the blink of an eye. The real work was about to begin. The sun rose on the first day of his sentence, and Bolverk, the evildoer, bent his back to the earth. The 9 thralls he had goaded into self-destruction had been strong, but they were mortals. Odin was not. He became a force of nature, a whirlwind of focused intent. He did not simply do the work of 9 men. He embodied the idea of 9 men. His scythe was a blur, moving with a speed that defied the eye, cutting through the vast hayfields not in neat rows, but in great sweeping arcs that seemed to swallow the landscape. The hay fell before him like an army before a storm. Where 9 men would have stopped to rest, to wipe the sweat from their brows, to drink from a waterskin, Bolverk worked on. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer on the anvil of his back, but the god inside felt nothing but the cold fire of his ambition. The other giants on Boggy's farmstead would watch him from a distance, their mouths agape. They saw a figure who never tired, whose muscles never cramped, whose pace never faltered from the first blush of dawn to the last embers of twilight. He was a machine of flesh and bone, powered by a singular, unyielding purpose. The days bled into weeks. The initial shock of the giants turned to a kind of fearful reverence. They whispered about him in the longhouse at night. Who was this stranger? What power drove him? He didn't eat with them, didn't drink with them, didn't speak unless spoken to. He simply worked. He hauled stones that would have taken 3 giants to move, stacking them into perfect, miles-long walls. He cleared entire forests, his axe ringing with a tireless, metronomic rhythm that echoed through the valleys. He was a ghost, a legend being born in the sweat and toil of a single summer. Odin, the Allfather, king of Asgard, was no stranger to sacrifice. He had hung from the world tree for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain the knowledge of the runes. He had plucked out his own eye and cast it into the well of Mimir for a drink of its cosmic wisdom. This was different. This wasn't a grand cosmic sacrifice. This was a gritty, humbling, day-by-day grinding down of the self. It was the ache in the bones, the sting of sweat in the eyes, the raw, blistered skin of his hands. Every swing of the axe, every lift of a stone, was a reminder of the prize. With each sunrise, he wasn't just working a field. He was forging a key, one agonizing step at a time, to unlock the prison of poetry. Finally, the last day of summer arrived. The harvest was in, larger and more plentiful than any Boggy had ever seen. The fields were immaculate, the walls were strong, the forests were cleared. The work of an entire decade had been accomplished in a single season. Bolverk, his disguise caked in the dust and grime of his labor, stood before Boggy. He had not shrunk from the work. He looked harder, leaner, more dangerous than ever. His one visible eye burned with an intensity that made the giant flinch. The agreement, he stated, his voice low and gravelly from disuse, was fulfilled. Now it was time for his payment. A single sip of the mead of Suttungr. Boggy shifted his weight, a mountain of unease. He had made the promise in a moment of desperation, never truly believing this lone worker could accomplish the impossible. But he had. And now the bill had come due. Boggy explained, stammering, that he didn't technically control the mead. It was his brother Suttungr who held it under lock and key. But he assured Bolverk he would speak to him, that he would try to persuade him. Together, they journeyed to the mountain Nipjord, the Clashing Rocks, a fortress of granite where Suttungr guarded his treasure. The air grew colder as they approached. Suttungr was a giant of immense size and even greater paranoia. He emerged from his mountain hall like a bear from its cave, his eyes small and suspicious in his massive, craggy face. He looked at the stranger, Bolverk, with open contempt, then turned his glare on his brother. Boggy, his voice trembling slightly, explained the situation. He told of the 9 dead thralls, the impossible bargain, and the miraculous summer of labor performed by the man who stood before them. He pleaded his case, arguing that a single sip was a small price for such a monumental feat. Suttungr listened, his expression unchanging, a mask of stone. When Boggy was finished, a low rumbling laugh escaped the giant's lips. It was a sound devoid of humor, like rocks grinding together deep underground. A single sip? He scoffed at the very idea. He wouldn't give a single drop of the rear, the stir of inspiration, to anyone. Not to his brother, not to a god, and certainly not to some wandering farmhand, no matter what impossible work he had performed. The mead was his. He had earned it by threatening the dwarves, and he would keep it, if he had to kill every last being in the 9 realms who came seeking it. His refusal was absolute. The deal was void. He turned his back on them both and lumbered back into the darkness of his mountain. The great stone door boomed shut, the sound echoing like a final judgment. Boggy was crestfallen but also relieved. He had tried. It wasn't his fault his brother was an unreasonable tyrant. He turned to Bolverk, ready to offer his apologies, perhaps some gold as compensation. But the look on Bolverk's face stopped him cold. The weary laborer was gone. In his place stood something ancient and terrible. The single eye blazed not with disappointment, but with cold, calculating fury. "A deal was made," Bolverk said, his voice no longer the rasp of a worker but the resonant command of a king. "And a deal will be honored. You gave your word. Your brother's greed does not release you from it. Since he will not grant us entry, you will help me make one." Odin knew this would happen. He had never intended to get the mead through honest negotiation. Suttungr's refusal wasn't a setback. It was the pretext he needed. It was the justification for the trickery to come. He was never Bolverk, the evildoer. He was Odin, the master strategist, and Suttungr had just walked right into his trap. From the folds of his cloak, he produced a tool, an auger, a massive drill bit named Rethi. He handed it to Boggy, whose hands trembled as he took it. "Your brother guards the front," Odin commanded, "so we will not use the door. Drill here." He pointed to a specific spot on the sheer rock face of the mountain. Boggy, trapped between his oath to this terrifying stranger and his fear of his murderous brother, had no choice. He placed the point of Rethi against the stone and began to turn it. The giant was strong, and the auger bit deep into the granite, the screech of metal on rock echoing in the silence. It was slow, grueling work. After a long while, Boggy pulled the auger back and announced that he was through. But Odin was a god of cunning, not of foolish trust. He peered into the dark hole, then simply blew into it. A shower of stone dust and rock chips flew back into his face, stinging his skin. The hole was a sham, a shallow deception. Boggy had lied. Odin's eye narrowed into a sliver of pure menace. He seized Boggy by the throat, his grip like iron bands, lifting the giant clean off his feet. He didn't shout. He whispered, and the whisper was more terrifying than any roar. "Drill again," he hissed. "And this time drill until you see the other side. If you try to deceive me again, this auger will find a much softer home in your skull." Terrified, Boggy did as he was told. He put his full panic strength into the task, his muscles straining, sweat pouring down his face. He drilled and drilled, the sound of grinding stone a frantic prayer. Odin stood over him, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Finally, with a sharp crack, the auger broke through. A tiny pinprick of darkness appeared at the bottom of the tunnel. It was done. Boggy pulled Rethi from the hole, panting. He turned to tell Bolverk, but the worker was gone. In his place, a long black serpent was already moving, its scales shimmering. Before the giant could even cry out, the snake shot forward, a flicker of darkness, and slithered headfirst into the narrow opening. In that instant, Boggy understood the depth of the deception. He had been used. A primal fear, not of the snake but of his brother Suttungr's wrath, seized him. In a desperate, panicked act of betrayal, he lunged forward, thrusting the sharp point of the auger into the hole, trying to impale the creature that had just disappeared within. But he was too slow. The serpent was already gone, twisting its way through the cold, dark heart of the mountain. Odin was inside. and Boggy was left alone on the outside, with nothing but a hole in the rock and the terrible knowledge of what he had just unleashed. The serpent's body scraped against raw, unyielding stone. For Odin, the All-Father ruler of Asgard, this was a profound humiliation. To be reduced to a slithering, limbless thing, inching his way through a passage no wider than a man's arm, was a trial of its own. The darkness was absolute, a physical pressure against his scales. The air was dead, tasting of ancient rock and the deep, cold stillness of the earth's heart. He could hear nothing but the rasp of his own movement and the faint, grinding echo of the auger Ruthi, still spinning in the world of light he had left behind. He pressed on. This was not a simple tunnel. It was a labyrinth, a network of cracks and fissures that twisted back on themselves, leading to dead ends of solid granite. It was as if the mountain itself was trying to confuse him, to trap him in its stony guts forever. But Odin was no mere god of war and thunder. He was a seeker of knowledge, a master of runes, a being whose mind could perceive patterns in chaos. He felt the subtle flows of air, the faint vibrations in the rock, the almost imperceptible pull of the great magic that lay at the mountain's core. He followed it like a compass needle pointing to a hidden pole. Hours bled into what could have been days. Time had no meaning in this chthonic darkness. There was only the goal, the burning singular purpose that had driven him from the heights of Asgard to the depths of this giant's fortress. The mead, the liquid poetry, the divine inspiration that could turn a fool into a sage and a god into something more. Then a change. The air grew warmer and it carried a scent. It was a complex, intoxicating aroma of fermented honey, dark berries, and something else. Something ancient and vital, like the smell of blood and wisdom mixed together. He was close. His serpent heart, if he'd had one, would have been pounding. He pushed through one final narrow gap, stone scraping a line of fire along his back, and then he was through. He tumbled out of the rock wall and onto a floor of polished, black obsidian. He uncoiled, his form shifting and expanding in the sudden vast space. Bones snapped back into place, limbs sprouted, and the rough, scaled skin smoothed into that of a god. He stood tall, no longer Balverk the Wanderer, but Odin the All-Father, cloaked in shadow and majesty. He was in a cavern so immense it seemed to swallow the very concept of sound. The ceiling was lost in a darkness pricked by the faint, cold glitter of embedded crystals, like a captive night sky. The air hummed, not with noise but with palpable power, a low thrumming that vibrated deep in his bones. And in the center of this colossal chamber, resting on pedestals of stone carved to look like grasping hands, were the three great vats. Rear, the stirrer of inspiration, Bon the offering vessel, and Sun the atonement. They were massive, each the size of a small house, forged from a metal that was neither gold nor bronze but seemed to drink the faint light. A faint mist, the very essence of the mead, coiled from their open tops, carrying that intoxicating scent. This was it, the source, the prize at the end of the world. But he was not alone. From the shadows beside the vats, a figure emerged. She was a giantess, but not the brutish, monstrous kind he had so often battled. This was Gunla, daughter of Suttungr. She was tall, her head nearly brushing the crystal stars far above, her form carved from living mountain stone. Her hair was the color of unrefined silver, cascading down her back like a frozen waterfall. Her eyes, when they fixed on him, were the color of a winter lake, deep and ancient and filled with a profound, soul-crushing loneliness. For countless ages she had been here, the sole guardian, the warden of this sacred place. She held a drinking horn in one hand, a horn so large it could have drowned a mortal man. She showed no fear, only a weary, monumental curiosity. "You are no serpent," she said, her voice not a shout, but a low rumble that was part of the cavern's own resonance. "And you are not my father's brother. I have felt your presence boring through my home for 3 days. Who are you that dares to invade the heart of Nipjorg?" Odin smiled, a slow, disarming expression that had calmed kings and charmed queens across the 9 realms. Brute force would be useless here. She was a daughter of giants, in her own sanctum, surrounded by the source of her power. But Odin's greatest weapon was never his spear, Gungnir. It was his tongue. "I am a traveler," he said, his voice weaving through the vast space, a thread of warmth in the immense cold. "A seeker of stories, a lover of beautiful things. And I have traveled a long dark road to gaze upon the most beautiful thing in all the realms." Gunlot's ancient eyes narrowed slightly, You speak of the mead. No, Odin replied, taking a step closer. I speak of its guardian. A flicker of something, surprise, confusion, perhaps even a hint of pleasure, crossed her stoic features. It was a crack in the mountain face, and Odin knew just how to widen it. For the next hour he spoke. He didn't plead or threaten. He wove words into a tapestry of starlight and wonder. He told her of Asgard's golden halls, of the Bifrost Bridge shimmering with impossible color, of the songs the Valkyries sing as they carry heroes to Valhalla. He spoke of the sun and the moon, of the rustle of leaves in a forest she had never walked, of the taste of salt on a sea breeze she had never felt. He painted a picture of the vibrant, living universe that existed just beyond her stone walls, a world she guarded but could never experience. He saw the longing in her eyes. She was a prisoner, gilded though her cage may be. She was starved not for food but for life, for connection. You have a silver tongue, stranger, she finally said, her voice softer now. But words will not earn you a drop of what you seek. My father's oath binds me. Oaths can be bent, Odin said smoothly, now standing only a few feet from her. He was a god, but he allowed himself to look small, vulnerable, before her towering form. Let me stay. Let me tell you more. Let this dark hall be filled with stories for just a few nights. Banish the silence that has been your only companion. He looked from her to the vats and back again. I ask for so little. 3 nights of your company. And for each night, you grant me a single sip of the mead. Gunnlod was silent for a long time, the weight of ages pressing down on her. 3 sips seemed so little. Her father had commanded her to guard the vats, but he had never forbidden her from sharing a taste. And the thought of company, of hearing this stranger's honeyed words fill the emptiness for 3 more nights, it was a temptation more powerful than any army. 3 nights, she agreed, her voice a low thunder of decision. And 3 sips. No more. And so began the seduction of the giant's daughter. For 3 days and 3 nights, Odin remained in the heart of the mountain. He was the perfect guest, the perfect companion. He filled the silent chamber with epics of creation and tales of cosmic wars. He sang songs of love and loss that made the very crystals on the ceiling weep with light. He treated Gunnlod not as a jailer or a monster, but as a queen, listening to her own quiet stories of the mountain's slow, deep life. He made her laugh, a sound like shifting continents, a sound she hadn't made in 1,000 years. He chased away the loneliness, replacing it with warmth and wit, and a shared intimacy in the heart of the world. She found herself captivated, enchanted not by a spell, but by the simple, powerful magic of a mind meeting hers in the darkness. By the end of the 3rd night, she was utterly lost to him. The lonely guardian had forgotten her duty, remembering only the handsome, silver-tongued god who had brought the entire universe into her prison. The bargain was fulfilled. It is time, she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. She rose to her full, magnificent height and led him towards the 3 great vats. Her trust in him was absolute. Her heart, which she thought was as cold and hard as the mountain around it, was now entirely his. She gestured to the first massive container, the one called Rear, the stirrer of inspiration. You have earned your first sip. He approached the great vat, the air around it humming with a power that was older than the mountains themselves. The scent rising from the golden liquid wasn't just of honey and herbs. It was the scent of forgotten languages, of unsung songs, of ideas waiting to be born. It smelled like potential itself. He leaned over the edge of Rear, his reflection staring back from the shimmering surface, the face of a wanderer, a laborer, a liar. But beneath that disguise, the single eye of a god burned with ancient hunger. Gunna watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw not a trickster but a being of immense thirst, a soul worthy of the universe's greatest prize. She had promised him a sip, a single taste for a night of divine union. But what is a sip to a god? Odin did not dip a horn or a cup. He placed his lips directly to the stone rim of the vat, tilted his head back, and began to drink. A single long continuous draught. It was not the sound of a man quenching his thirst. It was the sound of a maelstrom, a whirlpool opening in the heart of the world, drawing everything into its center. The level of the mead began to drop, visibly, impossibly fast. Gunnala's breath caught in her throat. This was no sip. This was a deluge. This was an emptying. The first drop that touched his tongue was an explosion. It wasn't a flavor, it was a feeling, a concept. It was the understanding of rhythm, of cadence, of the perfect word placed at the perfect moment. It was the raw, untamed power of inspiration, the force that makes a volcano erupt and a poet's heart ache. He drank deeper, and the history of every story ever told flooded his mind. He saw the first campfire, heard the first epic recited to a circle of wide-eyed mortals. He learned the secret names of the stars and the lullabies sung by mountains. He felt the joy of creation and the sorrow of a forgotten verse. He kept drinking, draining the very essence of what it meant to stir the soul, until the great vat of Rear was nothing but a hollow, echoing stone vessel. He pulled back, gasping not for air, but from the sheer immensity of what he now contained. His single eye blazed with a new light, a fire of pure, unadulterated creativity. He looked at Gunnel, and for a moment she didn't see Balverk the Charmer. She saw a king of cosmic power, and she was not frightened. She was mesmerized. He had not taken a sip. He had claimed his destiny. Without a word, he turned to the second container, the one called Bon, the offering. This was his right. The second night for the second sip. He did not wait for her permission this time. He was no longer a guest. He was a force of nature. He put his mouth to the second vat, and again he drank. If the first draft was inspiration, the second was knowledge. This was the offering. This was the substance of thought, the framework of wisdom. As the liquid meat poured into him, a cosmic library rearranged itself in his mind. He didn't just learn facts. He understood the connections between them. He saw the intricate, invisible web that tied the fall of a leaf in Midgard to the shifting of a star in the heavens. He understood the language of the birds, the whispers of the wind, the silent grammar of the stone. He absorbed the laws of magic, the architecture of the cosmos, the complete and unabridged history of the 9 realms, from the first spark of creation in the void of Ginnungagap to the final prophesied battle of Ragnarok. He saw the weaving of the Norns, the threads of fate that bound gods and men alike. He saw his own destiny laid bare, the triumphs, the sacrifices, and the final, inevitable encounter with the Fenris wolf. And he did not flinch. He drank it all in, every painful truth, every beautiful equation. The mead of Bon was the ultimate offering of reality itself, and he accepted it completely. The vat was empty. He stood up taller now, it seemed. The sheer weight of his presence bent the air around him. 2 of the 3 great vessels were dry. Gunnel finally felt the first cold prickle of fear. The awe was beginning to curdle into dread. The man she had given her heart to was devouring the sacred treasure her father had tasked her to protect. The love in her eyes began to war with the dawning horror of betrayal. This was more than a breach of trust. This was a divine heist unfolding before her very eyes. Odin turned to the third and final vessel.
Son, diatunamen.
The reconciler. This mead was different. It didn't hold the fire of creation or the cold logic of knowledge. It held the most elusive power of all. The ability to make it beautiful. The power to take the raw, chaotic inspiration from Rear, shape it with the profound wisdom from Bon, and turn it into something that could heal, persuade, and transform. It was the power of eloquence, of diplomacy, of poetry so perfect it could make enemies weep and embrace as brothers. It was the magic that could reconcile the irreconcilable. As he moved towards it, Gunnel finally found her voice, a choked whisper. Balverk, stop. He did not look at her. He could not. The god inside had taken over completely. The mission was everything. He put his lips to the final vat. As he began to drink, the full, terrible truth crashed down upon her. The 3 nights of passion. The whispered promises. The oath. It was all a lie. A magnificent, perfectly executed, soul-crushing lie. She hadn't been loved. She had been used. She was not a queen in a love story. She was a key, a lock, a means to an end. Her father, Suttungr, had killed for this mead. He had entrusted it to her, his only daughter, and she had given it away for a phantom's embrace. Her heart, which had melted for him, now shattered into a million pieces of icy rage and shame. Odin drained the last drop from Sun, and as he did, the final transformation occurred. The 3 streams of power, inspiration, knowledge, and eloquence merged within him. They did not mix, they alloyed. They became a new substance, a divine faculty that had never existed before in one being. He now possessed the total power of the spoken and unspoken word. He could craft a rune that could raise the dead. He could sing a song that could move mountains. He could speak a truth so pure it would end a war. He was no longer just Odin, the Allfather, king of the Aesir. He was the vessel. He was the poet god. He stood straight, the power thrumming through his very bones, making the stone chamber tremble. He finally turned to look at Gunnel. Her face was a mask of utter heartbreak, tears carving paths through the dust on her cheeks, her eyes burning with the fury of a betrayed goddess. The love was gone, replaced by a hatred as deep and as cold as the heart of the mountain. He knew with the perfect clarity the mead had given him that he had only seconds. He could not fight his way out. Her grief had made her strong enough to tear him limb from limb. The tunnel he had entered through was too slow. Suttungr would be returning. The chamber was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. He had to leave. Now, but a serpent could be trapped. A man could be crushed. He needed a form built for speed, for the open sky, for a desperate escape. Gunnel lunged, her scream of rage and sorrow the sound of a glacier breaking apart. But she was too late. As her hands reached for him, the form of Balverk the Wanderer began to twist and collapse inward. His bones cracked and reformed, his shoulders hunched and broadened, and from his back, tearing through skin and cloth, erupted the foundations of two massive wings, covered in the sudden, shocking bloom of dark, powerful feathers. The transformation was agony. Every sinew screamed as it was stretched beyond its limits. Every bone groaned as it was reshaped by sheer, indomitable will. The air was torn by a sound that was half shriek, half roar. The cry of a god being unmade and remade into something both lesser and greater. His human face elongated into a lethal, curving beak. His eyes, once the windows to a cunning and ancient mind, became the predatory, all-seeing orbs of a raptor, burning with a cold blue fire. The last vestiges of his human form vanished under a torrent of obsidian feathers, each one sharp as a shard of flint. And then with a final shuddering crack of his new form, Odin, the Allfather, king of Asgard, was gone. In his place was an eagle. Not just an eagle, but the very archetype of one. A creature of impossible size, a feathered storm of muscle and fury, with a wingspan that could blot out the sun. He flexed his new wings, the movement powerful enough to kick up a cyclone of dust and rock. The feeling was alien, yet instinctual. He could feel the currents of the air, taste the direction of the wind, see the world in a spectrum of detail no human eye could ever comprehend. With a single mighty downstroke, he launched himself into the sky. The ground fell away with breathtaking speed. The forests of Jotunheim became a textured green carpet below, the river's silver threads woven through it. He was a shadow moving against the clouds, a silent winged death soaring towards his singular purpose. His destination was a jagged peak in the distance, a mountain that seemed to claw at the sky itself. Nipjord, the clashing rocks. It was there, deep within the mountain's stone heart, that the giant Suttungr had hidden the three great vats of the rear, the Mead of Poetry. As he drew closer, the sheer scale of the fortress became apparent. This was no simple mountain cave. Nipjord was a natural citadel, its sheer cliffs polished smooth by ancient winds, offering no purchase for even the most skilled climber. Suttungr had chosen his vault well. Odin circled high above, his eagle eyes scanning every crack and crevice. There was no entrance, no gate, no window, not even a fissure wide enough for a snake to slip through. It was a perfect, seamless tomb of granite, sealed by giant magic and paranoia. Brute force was useless here. Even in this mighty form, he could beat his wings against the stone until they were broken and bloody, and he would accomplish nothing. His mind, ever the sharper weapon, began to race. He needed another way. A crack in the armor not of the mountain, but of the family that guarded it. Spiraling downward, he saw movement at the base of the mountain. A vast field, and in it, 9 figures toiling under the sun. They were thralls, servants of the giants, swinging scythes with a weary, inefficient rhythm. Their blades were dull, catching and tearing at the hay rather than slicing it. Standing apart from them was a giant, his form immense and powerful, shouting orders and frustrations. This, Odin knew from his long and careful study, was Boggi, Suttungr's brother. And where Suttungr was paranoid and hoarding, Boggi was practical and concerned with the simple, immense work of running their domain. An opportunity, a key. Odin plummeted from the sky, landing in a secluded grove of trees out of sight. The brutal transformation reversed itself. bones snapping back into their human configuration, feathers receding into skin. He stood not as the king of Asgard, but as a wanderer tall and strong, his face weathered by travel, one eye covered by the brim of a wide hat. He called himself Bolverk now, a name that meant evil worker, a promise of the chaos he was about to unleash. He strode out from the trees and approached the 9 laboring thralls. They barely looked up, their faces slick with sweat, their arms aching. "Your work goes slowly," Bolverk's voice boomed, startling them. "It's the fault of your tools. A dull blade makes for a long day." The thralls grumbled in agreement, complaining about their master's cheapness. "Let me help," Bolverk said, a sly glint in his single eye. From a pouch at his belt, he produced a whetstone. It was a simple, smooth stone, yet it seemed to hum with a faint inner power. He took the nearest scythe and drew the stone along its edge. The sound was not the grating scrape of stone on metal, but a clean musical hiss, like quenching hot steel in water. He handed the scythe back. "Try it now." The thrall, skeptical, swung the blade. It sliced through the tall grass with an effortless shining. There was no resistance. The grass fell in a perfect, clean arc. The thrall's eyes went wide with astonishment. The others clamored around, thrusting their own dull scythes at Bolverk. One by one, he sharpened their blades until they were all impossibly, magically keen. The work that had taken them hours was now being done in minutes. They were overcome with gratitude and awe, and then with greed. They all wanted the whetstone. They offered him coins, trinkets, anything they had. Bolverk held up a hand. "I can see you all desire it," he said, his voice laced with a dark amusement. "But I have only one. It seems unfair to sell it to just one of you." He looked at their desperate, pleading faces. "So let's make it a game of skill. He who is quick enough to catch it may have it." Before they could process his words, he tossed the whetstone high into the air. It spun end over end, catching the sunlight, a tiny star falling back to earth. What happened next was a blur of primal, thoughtless greed. 9 men, 9 lethally sharp scythes held in their hands. 9 pairs of eyes locked on the falling stone. They forgot their camaraderie, forgot their own safety. They lunged. They leaped over one another, shoving and clawing, each man desperate to be the one to snatch the prize from the air. In the frantic, tangled scramble, the scythe swung wildly. A blade meant for grass met a throat. A razor edge meant for hay sliced through an arm. A man tripped, and the swing of his neighbor's scythe took his head clean from his shoulders. It was a maelstrom of accidental, self-inflicted slaughter. In seconds, the field was silent, save for the soft thud of the whetstone landing in the blood-soaked grass. 9 bodies lay twisted among the perfectly cut hay, their own miraculous tools having become the instruments of their demise. Bolverk, the evil worker, watched without a flicker of emotion, then calmly picked up his whetstone, wiped it clean and waited. Soon the giant Boggy returned, bellowing for his workers. He stopped dead, his face a mask of horror and disbelief, his entire workforce gone, the harvest ruined. He roared in frustration and despair. How could he possibly manage this alone? It was then that Bolverk stepped from the scene of the carnage he had orchestrated. "You seem to be in need of a worker," he said calmly. Boggy stared at the stranger. "A worker? I need 9. The work of 9 men. Who are you?" "I am Bolverk," Odin replied, "and I will do the work of 9 men for you. I will see your entire harvest brought in before the first snow." The giant scoffed. "Impossible. No single man could do that." "I am not just any man," Bolverk said, his single eye boring into the giant. "I will do this for you, but my price is not in gold or silver." Boggy was desperate. The loss of the harvest would mean a hard winter and, worse, the fury of his brother Suttungr. "Name it," the giant grumbled. "Anything." Odin allowed a slow, predatory smile to cross his lips. "When the work is done," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you will help me get 1 single drink, 1 sip of your brother Suttungr's famous mead." Boggy's face went pale. He knew what the stranger was asking for. He knew the vow his brother had made, the guards he had set, the terrible price for any who tried to steal it. To help this man would be to betray his own blood, to risk his brother's legendary wrath. But he looked at the field of dead workers, at the endless acres of hay waiting to be cut, and felt the cold hand of desperation closing around his throat. He was trapped. Looking back at the calm, confident stranger who offered an impossible solution for an impossible price, Boggy saw no other choice. He slowly, reluctantly nodded his head. "It's a deal." The words, once spoken, could not be unsaid. They settled over the field like a shroud, a promise made between a desperate giant and a disguised god. The stranger Bolverk wasted no time. He turned from Boggy, his weathered face unreadable, and strode back towards the 9 exhausted farmhands. They watched him approach, their eyes hollow, their bodies slumped over their dull sighs. They had heard the impossible bargain. Harvest this entire valley by sundown? It was a cruel joke. A death sentence. Bolverk stopped before them. From a pouch at his belt, he produced a simple whetstone. But as he held it up, the fading afternoon light seemed to catch it in a strange way. It didn't just reflect the sun. It seemed to drink it in, glowing with a soft internal luminescence. He offered it to the nearest man. "Sharpen your blades," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. The man hesitated, then took the stone. The moment his fingers touched it, a jolt went through him. He looked down at the glowing object in his hand, then at his battered scythe. He ran the stone along the edge of the blade. A sound unlike any other filled the air. It wasn't the grating screech of metal on stone. It was a song, a high, clear, ringing note that vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. The other thralls stared as the dull, chipped edge of the scythe transformed before their eyes. It became impossibly keen, honed to a razor's thinness, the edge gleaming with a hungry silver light. One by one they passed the whetstone, and one by one their tools were reborn. The men themselves seemed to change. The weariness in their shoulders lessened, replaced by a strange, feverish energy. They looked at their gleaming scythes, then at the endless sea of grain, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than despair appeared in their eyes. It was a wild, dangerous hope. And then Bolverk did something truly bizarre. He took the whetstone back and, with a powerful flick of his wrist, tossed it high into the air. It spun end over end, catching the sun like a fallen star. Instinct took over. 9 men who moments before could barely stand, lunged for it. In their desperate greed to possess this magical object, they swung their newly sharpened scythes at each other, a chaotic, deadly dance of flashing steel. In a matter of seconds it was over. 9 bodies lay still in the field, their own miraculous blades having become their doom. Bolverk looked upon the grim scene without a flicker of emotion. He had not killed them. Their own greed had. He had simply provided the catalyst. He picked up a scythe, its edge still humming with latent power, and turned to the stunned and horrified Boggy. "The field will be harvested," Bolverk stated, his voice as cold as the northern sea. "I will do it myself." What followed was not work. It was a force of nature. Bolverk moved through the grain not like a man, but like a whirlwind. The supernaturally sharp scythe became an extension of his will, a silver crescent of destruction that leveled everything in its path. The grain fell in perfect, neat rows as if bowing before a king. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood, and still the lone figure moved, a relentless engine of harvest, never tiring, never slowing. Boggy could only watch, his mouth agape, a knot of pure dread tightening in his stomach. He had made a deal not with a wandering laborer, but with something far, far older and more powerful. As the last rays of sunlight vanished behind the mountains, the final stalk of grain fell. The entire vast field was cleared. Silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind. Bolverk stood in the center of the perfectly mown valley, not even breathing heavily. He planted the scythe in the earth and turned to face Boggy. He didn't need to say a word. His eyes, burning with cold fire in the twilight, said everything. A deal is a deal. Boggy swallowed hard, his throat dry. My brother," he stammered. "Suttungr. He holds the mead. He guards it. He won't just give it to you. You promised me a drink." Bolverk's voice was low, menacing. "How you get it for me is your concern. Lead the way." There was no arguing. Boggy turned and began the trek towards the mountains, the stranger following a few paces behind, a silent, ominous shadow. They walked for hours, climbing higher and higher into the jagged peaks of Jotunheim. The air grew thin and cold. Finally, they came to a place that seemed to be the very heart of the mountains, Nipjorg. It wasn't a fortress built by hands, it was the mountain, a single monolithic peak of black granite, its sides sheer and unclimbable, a fist of stone clenched against the sky. There were no gates, no windows, no visible entrance. It was a tomb, a vault designed by nature to be utterly impenetrable. "He's in there," Boggy said, his voice barely a whisper, "with the mead. And his daughter Gunlod guards it day and night. No one gets in. No one." Bolverk walked to the base of the mountain, running a hand over the cold, smooth stone. "Suttungr will not give me a drink, you say?" "Never," Boggy confirmed, a hint of relief in his voice. He swore an oath. "The deal is impossible. You can't hold me to it." Bolverk turned slowly, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "I didn't ask for Suttungr to give me a drink. I asked you to get me one. And you will." From his pack, Bolverk produced a tool, a long, wicked-looking drill, an auger named Rethi. It seemed to hum with the same strange energy as the whetstone. "You will drill a hole. Right here." Boggy's eyes went wide. Drill through the heart of a mountain? It was madness. But one look at Bolverk's face told him that refusing was the greater madness. He took the auger and set to work. The giant's strength was immense, and the magical drill bit deep into the stone. But as he worked, a cunning, treacherous thought entered Boggy's mind. He drilled for a time, then pulled the auger out. "It is done," he announced, trying to keep his voice steady. Bolverk stepped up to the small hole. He leaned in and blew. A shower of stone dust and grit flew right back into his face. He stood up, wiping the dust from his eyes. The smile was gone. His face was a mask of cold fury. The illusion of a simple traveler was stripped away, and for a terrifying moment, Boggy saw the being underneath, ancient, powerful, and utterly without mercy. The air crackled. The temperature dropped. "You think me a fool?" The voice was no longer that of a man. It was a low growl, the sound of grinding glaciers and distant thunder. "You think you can deceive me?" He grabbed Boggy by the front of his tunic, lifting the giant effortlessly off his feet. "Drill again. And if you try to trick me one more time, this mountain will be your tomb." Terrified, Boggy did as he was told. He drilled with all his might, fear giving him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He drilled and drilled until the auger suddenly broke through into emptiness on the other side. He pulled it out, trembling. It's through." Bolverk peered into the narrow hole. A faint light and the distant sound of a woman's voice, singing softly, drifted out. He turned to Boggy. "My payment is within reach." And then, before the giant's astonished eyes, the stranger began to change. His form wavered, shimmered, and then collapsed inward. Bones softened, limbs fused, and his body elongated, shrinking and twisting into a new shape. Within seconds, the traveler Bolverk was gone. In his place on the ground was a long, dark serpent, its scales glistening in the moonlight, its unblinking eyes holding an intelligence that was terrifyingly ancient. The snake moved with liquid speed, slithering towards the hole in the mountain. This was it, the final step, the way into the vault. But as the serpent's head entered the narrow tunnel, Boggy was seized by one last, desperate act of betrayal. He was terrified of Suttungr's wrath, terrified of the serpent god before him. He saw one chance to end this, to erase his mistake. He lifted the heavy stone auger high above his head, aiming the sharp point directly at the serpent's disappearing body, and with a guttural roar, he thrust it down into the hole with all his might. The stone didn't just strike flesh, it shattered the very silence of the mountain's heart. A sound like tearing rock and splintering bone erupted from the tunnel as the serpent convulsed in its death throes. The entire chamber shuddered, dust and pebbles raining down from the ceiling. Gunlod let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure horror, as the last vestiges of her father's monstrous form went limp. But Odin didn't hesitate. He didn't look back at the woman whose heart he had just broken, whose trust he had just shattered into a million pieces. He knew what was happening outside. The psychic shockwave of Suttungr's death would be radiating through the mountain. The giant would know. He would know he had been deceived. Odin scrambled back to the main chamber, the three great horns of Mead standing like silent monuments to his victory and his betrayal. He was trapped. The only way out was the way he came in, a path that would lead him directly into the waiting, murderous arms of Suttungr. He was deep in the earth, a lone god in the heart of his enemy's fortress. But Odin was not a god of brute force. He was the god of cunning, of inspiration, of the desperate, brilliant idea that strikes in the final second. He looked at the horns, then at the small hole the augur had made. It wasn't an escape route for a man, or even a god, but for something else. He uncorked the first horn, rear, the stirrer of inspiration, and began to drink. The taste was indescribable, a universe of flavor and knowledge flooding his senses. He drank it all, the entire vessel, feeling the power of every poem ever conceived, every story ever told surging through his veins. He moved to the second horn, the vessel, and drained it completely. Then the third, sun, the reconciliation, until all three were empty. The entire supply of the mead of poetry, the most potent substance in the 9 realms, was now inside him. His body radiated a cosmic heat. His mind expanded, touching the edges of creation. He could feel the thoughts of the giants outside, feel Suttungr's dawning rage turning into a cataclysmic inferno. There was no time. He focused all his will, all the new raw world-shaping power of the mead, and began to change. His bones hollowed and reshaped themselves with agonizing cracks. His skin tore as thousands of black feathers erupted from his body. His nose and jaw elongated, hardening into a sharp, cruel beak. His arms flattened into powerful wings. In seconds, the Allfather was gone, and in his place stood a great eagle, his eyes burning with ancient intelligence. With a powerful beat of his new wings, he launched himself towards the small hole in the mountain wall. He squeezed through, stones scraping against his feathers, and burst out into the cold, gray skies of Jotunheim. He was free. For a fraction of a second he soared, the wind a glorious song beneath his wings. Then he heard the roar. It was a sound of pure geological fury. Suttungr, standing atop the mountain, saw the eagle. He didn't need to guess. He knew. The rage of the giant was a physical force, so immense and so powerful that he too began to transform. His body swelled, his features distorted, his arms became vast, feathered limbs. He became an eagle as well, but one born of rage and stone, larger, stronger, and faster than Odin. A shadow that blotted out the sun. And the chase began. This was no simple flight. It was a desperate, realm-spanning pursuit for the soul of creativity itself. Odin flew with the full weight of the mead sloshing within him, a precious heavy burden that slowed his flight. Suttungr flew with the lightness of pure vengeance. The giant eagle closed the distance with terrifying speed, the wind from his wing beats like hurricanes tearing at Odin's tail feathers. Below them, the jagged peaks and frozen rivers of the land of giants blurred into a gray smear. Odin pushed himself harder, flying towards the shimmering boundary that separated Jotunheim from the realm of the gods. He could feel Suttungr's presence right behind him, a suffocating pressure, the promise of death. The giant's beak, sharp as obsidian, snapped at the air just inches from his body. He could feel the heat of the giant's fury. This was it, the final, desperate gamble. As he burst through the celestial barrier into the skies of Asgard, he saw it. On the highest rampart of the Golden City, the Aesir, the gods, were waiting. They had seen him coming, a dark speck pursued by a monstrous shadow. They had understood. Lined up along the wall were massive vats, huge cauldrons hastily brought from the feasting halls. It was now or never. Suttungr made a final cataclysmic lunge, his talons extended, his beak open for the killing strike. With no other choice, Odin dove towards the walls of Asgard and, as he flew over the waiting vats, he opened his beak and regurgitated the precious mead. A shimmering golden river of pure inspiration poured from him, filling the containers below with the liquid genius of the cosmos. But in his haste, in the sheer terror of that final second with Suttungr's beak snapping at his tail, he was startled, and a few drops of the precious mead were jolted out of him, not from his mouth, but from his other end. These drops spattered onto the ground below, a tainted, lesser portion. Suttungr, seeing his prize delivered into the hands of his enemies, let out a final shriek of thwarted rage and turned back towards his own dark realm, defeated. Odin, exhausted and trembling, landed on the walls of Asgard, transforming back into his divine form. The gods cheered. They had it. The source of all poetry, all song, all brilliant ideas was finally theirs. And so the mead of poetry was divided. The vast majority, the pure, golden liquid that Odin had carefully poured into the vats, was kept for the gods themselves and for their most favored mortals. These were the true poets, the skalds, the masters of verse whose words could charm kings, inspire armies, and capture the very essence of life and death. When a truly great artist is born, when a scientist has a flash of insight that changes the world, when a composer writes a melody that will echo for eternity, the Norse would say they have been granted a sip from Odin's vats. But what of those other drops? The small, tainted portion that was lost in the panic of the final chase? That became known as the skaldfifla, the bad poet's share. This was the source of all the hacks, the charlatans, the writers of terrible, clumsy verse. It explains every cliché, every failed metaphor, every song that makes you cringe. It is the inspiration for the uninspired. The myth, in its brilliance, accounts not only for genius but for the lack of it. And what of Gunlod, the giantess who gave Odin everything? She was left behind, abandoned in the hollow mountain, her father murdered, her lover revealed as a thief, her heart a cold, empty chamber. Her story is the silent, tragic cost of Odin's victory. It's the dark truth at the heart of the myth. That great inspiration, the kind that shapes the world, is rarely clean. It is often born from pain, from deception, and from a broken heart left weeping in the dark. This entire epic, from the murder of a peaceful god to a cosmic chase between two eagles, is not just a story. It is a profound metaphor for the creative process itself. It tells us that inspiration isn't some gentle gift from the heavens. It is a violent, passionate, and dangerous substance. It is born from sacrifice, brewed with cunning, stolen through deception, and won through a life or death struggle. Every great idea you've ever had, every moment of clarity, every spark of creativity that feels like magic, the Norse would say that is the echo of the Mead of Poetry. It's the understanding that true genius isn't just a gift from the gods. It's a treasure stolen from giants, paid for with a broken heart, and carried home on the brink of destruction.